Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Revelation class. We are in class number 33 today, and today we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, and this is the 144,000 make it to heaven. And this is the last of the stories from the midpoint. We've been in the midpoint now for about 2 months, and you're probably saying, when are we ever going to get out of the midpoint? And the answer is today. We are finishing up the midpoint today. The last story from the midpoint is the one that we're going to be going through today, and next week we'll be into the second half of the tribulation. So you may have been wondering about that, and now you know. Before I get started with today's lesson, though, I realized that I didn't present something well last week, and I wanted to go back and talk about it again because I think I probably confused more people than I helped with it. We were talking about, at the end of Revelation 13, let me reread these 3 verses for you again, just to reset your mind. This is talking about the second beast now. It says, "He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name." The number of his name. Okay? This calls for wisdom of understanding what he's talking about here. "If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast. For it is man's number, his number is 666. So I kind of talked through this last week, and I realized I didn't explain it well. 666, as we said, is the beast number. And what John's talking about here when he says, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. The number of his name. What exactly were they talking about? And this has to do with something really weird about Hebrew that I just totally forgot to tell you last week when I was explaining this. Hebrew has something very unusual about it that's different from the languages that we all know today, English. Today in English, we have, looking for a place to write here, we have 26 letters, and we have 5 vowels, and we have 21 consonants. In addition to that, we have 10 numbers, and that's 0 through 9. And so our information, when we convey it to each other today with our speech, with our writing, with our mathematics, whatever, we have 36 different characters that we can use. 26 letters, 5 of them vowels, 21 consonants, and 10 letters. Okay, Hebrew doesn't work like this at all. Hebrew is very different. Hebrew is a very old language that comes back from the time of Moses, from about 3,500 years ago when things were really different. Hebrew only has 22 characters. And these are the names of the characters, and they're on the back of your handout at the back, the one that Deb just handed out. And they run from, and Hebrew has no vowels at all. There are no vowels in Hebrew. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And there are also no numbers in Hebrew. Hebrew does not have numbers. Instead, and by the way, God gave Hebrew to Moses back in the time of the Exodus. That's where Hebrew came from. At least that's the Jewish tradition, is that God gave it to Moses as a language. It was one of the very first languages in the world. Back around 14 or 1500 BC, people didn't have alphabets. They spoke languages, and they could write, but they wrote with pictures of like birds, and trees, and cats, and dogs, and whatever. So they wrote with pictures, but the alphabet came along in about the 1400 to 1500 BC era, which was the same era as the Exodus. And since Hebrew was one of the very first languages to come along, many people think that when God gave Hebrew to the Jews, that might have been the very first alphabet language, the very first language that could actually be written. But when you go through Hebrew, there are only 22 characters. They are all consonants. There are no vowels. And each one of them actually has a numerical value associated with it. So when you see the letter Aleph, and if you want to see what Aleph looks like, it's in your handout. That's kind of some squiggly lines. But if you use the letter Aleph, you don't know at the time you put it down whether you are talking about an aleph or whether you're talking about the number 1. It could be either one. It could be used either way. So when John's talking here about the number of the letters of the beast's name, what he's saying is, if you take the beast's name, whatever that is, and the beast's name is going to be 666, so that's going to be 400, which is Tav, plus 200, which is Reich, plus 60, which is Samek, plus 6, which is Vav. So those are going to be the 4 characters, the 4 consonants of his name, is what John is saying here. So his name is going to be Tav, Reich, Samek, Vav, when it's spelled in Hebrew. Now the guy's probably not going to be Jewish, so his name's not going to be, his name's going to be in some other language. English maybe, or French, or who knows, Russian, whatever. So when you convert his name into Hebrew and take out the vowels, what you're going to have left is 4 consonants. And those 4 are going to be Tav, Reich, Samek, and Vav, is what John is telling us. And that's one of the ways we will know that this is the Antichrist, is that his name, written in Hebrew, will be these 4 letters, 600, 60, and 6. So, am I still losing people, or is it starting to make a little sense? You look like you have a question. No.
So instead of like 200, could it be 250s and a 100?
It can be when you get above 400. Yeah, if you get above 400, 400 is the biggest number they have. Now, in those days, most people didn't have more than 400 sheep, for example, or whatever. So they probably didn't have more than 400 bushels of grain that they brought to market. So that wasn't a big issue back then. But if you for example, at the time of when Joshua led the Jews across the River Jordan, the people of Israel had to stay 2,000 steps behind the Ark of the Covenant when the Ark of the Covenant crossed the river, because the Ark of the Covenant stopped the water in the river. In other words, the priests walked in with the Ark of the Covenant into the middle of the river, and the water stopped flowing because it was high water. And then the people were able to cross on dry land, kind of like the Red Sea in Moses' time. And 2,000 in that case would be Tav, 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 5 400s. Okay. Could you write it different ways? I don't think so. That's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think you could, for example, write 666 as Kuf, 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 and then Samek and Vav. I don't think you could write it that way, but I'm not enough of an expert on Hebrew to really know that. I think that's really your question. Good question. Don't know. So what John was talking about, and bear in mind, John wrote this in Greek, right? John didn't write this in Hebrew, but John was a Jew, so he knew his Hebrew. He grew up in Israel, so he knew his Hebrew. And what he was talking about of the numbers of the letters of the beast's name is this thing here. Does that make any sense of what we were talking about last week? Okay, so I wanted to just kind of go back and review that again. Oh, by the way, the question of how do you tell the difference between whether it's being used as a letter or whether it's being used as a number, the Hebrews, or the Jews who know Hebrew, do it entirely by context. So for example, if I were to put up my name, let's say this is in Hebrew, it's not, because I don't know it in Hebrew. First of all, I have to take out the vowel, because they don't have a vowel, okay? But they don't know how to pronounce my name. If I say my name is BD in Hebrew, whatever that is, I think it's bad. But if I say that that's my name in Hebrew, they don't know how to pronounce that. They don't know what I mean. If they see that word just standing by itself, they don't know what it means. In order to understand that word, they have to see it in a sentence. That's what I mean when I say it has to be in context. So if I were to say, my name is BB, and they know I'm a male, they'll probably put an O in here and get the name right. If I were to say my name is BB and I were a female, they might think my name is Bab, maybe, which I do know of some ladies named Bab. And they might throw an A in there. Or if I would say, I want to put a BB on my baby before he eats, they might put an I in there. I know I'm talking about a bib. So the way that the Jews figure out vowels is through the context of how it's used in the sentence. The same thing's true with numbers. If I were to say, if I were to put together a word with Tav, Reich, Samek, Vav, they would have no idea whether I'm talking about what I'm talking about. It would, I mean, unless I use it in context in some way. If I were to say, if I were to actually use that word, whatever it is, then they would put vowels in and make it. If I were to use it in a sentence. But if I were to say I have 666 sheep and put that in a sentence, then they would realize that that is talking about 666 sheep. In other words, they would realize that it's a number, and they realize that from context. So Jews, when they're using Hebrew, put everything in context, which helps them to know, A, is it a vowel, or, what are the vowels that belong in there, and B, is it a number or is it being used as a consonant? So that's some background for you of just what I was talking about last week, but more importantly, what John was talking about last week in chapter 13 of Revelation.
So John, though, he wrote all of this in Greek, right?
Correct.
Right?
But he knew Hebrew because he came from Israel. He was one of Jesus' disciples. So he certainly knew Hebrew. And what he's talking about here when he says, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name, and then he goes on to say, this calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast. That's telling us that this is about the Hebrew calculation that he's doing there. Make sense? Other questions before we move on?
So other people can have the name of the beast too, but this is going to be evident who he is because he's going to rise up as a leader.
Correct.
Well, if his name is Sam.
George or Tom or whatever. Yeah. Right.
Other people have that name too, but he will be known because of the number of his name or the name.
Well,
he'll be known because he rises up as a leader.
Right. He will be the leader of the world.
It'll be evident to them.
But yes, it will be evident. It will be evident to that. But if you really want to confirm it, look to make sure these 4 letters are in his name.
Are in his name.
But in his name in Hebrew. That's the other part. Somebody's got to convert his name to Hebrew, which I can't do. But somebody who knows a lot more about Hebrew than I do would have to convert his name into Hebrew. And Hebrew has interesting meanings and stuff. Hebrew letters have meaning. I don't want to get too far afield, but each letter actually has a story associated with that letter in Hebrew. And you can do pictures. That's why some of the letters look kind of like pictures.
Yeah.
And the Chinese do that too. Japanese does that too. The letters look a lot like pictures because they evolved from a picture kind of thing over in Japan and China.
So the Jewish people have revived the Hebrew language has been revived, by them.
Yes.
So they're very familiar with it. So a Jewish person won't get that.
A Jewish person would get that very easily.
Because to them, Hebrew, because they know it.
Yeah,
They're
a friend.
taught it, right?
Yeah, this is pretty much the same Hebrew that was used by Moses.
Ancient.
A good friend of mine who's Jewish says if Jesus were to come back today and walk into Tel Aviv and pick up a newspaper, he could read it. He would be able to know exactly what it's saying. So
they'll know.
It hasn't changed a whole lot since the time of Moses.
So they'll know.
Okay, anything else before we move on to today's lesson? Well, let me start by reading today's lesson, which is Revelation 14, 1 through 5. And this is the story of the 144,000 again. This is John speaking. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. So they have the name of Christ written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven, like the roar of rushing waters, and like a loud peal of thunder. And and they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They were blameless. So we're going to talk through that today. So where we are, just to level set again, we're at the midpoint in the tribulation period. So remember, our timeline starts with Christ 2,000 years ago, the cross. We've had the church age, which went for 2,000 years. It ended at the rapture, which is at some point in the near future here. We're just, some point before the rapture today. Then we went into 3.5 years, which was the first half of the tribulation. And now we're at the midpoint. So at the first half, at the rapture point, the church is gone from the world. The church is gone after that point. And we came to the midpoint, which is where we've been for the last couple months. And that's where today's class is. We're finishing up the midpoint. Then we're going to move into the second half of the tribulation, then the second coming of Christ, and then on into the millennial kingdom here. So that's kind of where we are on the timeline of this whole thing. So remember, as we look through these 8 or 9 different stories of what happened during the midpoint, the most important one was that Satan got thrown out of heaven. Satan, up until that point, remember this from the book of Job, Satan had the ability to go into heaven to the throne room of God and talk to God. We saw that in Job 1 and Job 2. We don't know how often he had that, but it's but from what John said in Revelation, that Satan was able to go in and accuse the faithful in front of God on a regular basis. So he's able to walk into God's throne room and say, hey, Bob, that guy Bob that you kind of like down here on earth, let me tell you the sins this guy's committing, right? Satan had that ability to walk into God's throne room and do that on a regular basis, and do that with all of us on a regular basis. That gets taken away here at the midpoint of the tribulation. At the midpoint of the tribulation, Satan no longer has that power. That is taken away. He is thrown out of heaven. God uses Michael the archangel to throw him out of heaven. He is thrown out of heaven and thrown down to the earth. Now, Satan has always kind of been the lord of the earth. I mean, this is his domain, right? This is where sin is down here. And this is where evil is down here. So Satan has always been sort of in charge of the earth down here. But now it's his only place. He can't go back to heaven anymore. He has no more ability to go up there. So he has to make some changes. Or he doesn't have to make some changes, but he decides, if I can't go back to heaven, then I think what I'm going to do is take over this guy called the Antichrist, who's kind of running things now down on earth, and take over for him. So the Antichrist gets killed off. Remember that. We saw that back a couple of chapters ago. The Antichrist gets a fatal gash in his head, a sword wound, a fatal wound in his head. The Antichrist dies. And his body is then resurrected by Satan, because Satan comes in and indwells him. We saw this in chapter 12 of Revelation, that Satan comes into the Antichrist's body and indwells him. So at that point, to the people on earth, this is still going to look like the Antichrist. It's still going to, other than the fact that he's got this big gash in his head, this is going to look like the Antichrist. But it really is Satan who's inside of him now. So John uses the term, instead of using the Antichrist or Satan anymore, he now uses the term the beast. And this is, we call him the beast from this point forward. In chapter 12, he gets the name the beast. So he's now the beast. Later on in chapter 12, there's a second beast that comes in. The first beast, the one I just talked about, is called the beast from the sea. The second beast is the beast from the land. And he's the religious leader. That's the right-hand man of the beast. So the new beast who comes on, his job is to get people to worship the beast. The beast goes up to the temple and declares himself to be God. It's the abomination of desolation. And he makes that permanent by putting a big statue up in the temple, a statue of himself. And that statue, we don't know exactly how it happens, but Satan is able to make that statue breathe and talk, even when the Antichrist isn't there. So he uses some sort of technology or demons or something to make that statue talk in the temple. And then the second beast requires people to go to the temple and worship that statue. So that's kind of the point we're at as we're approaching the end of the midpoint of the tribulation here. And there are obviously most people, oh, by the way, in addition to that, if you don't take this mark of the beast, the 666 on your forehead or on your arm, if you don't take that mark, you can't buy or sell. So you can't buy food. as we all know, if there's not enough food on the grocery stores, you got a problem, right? We're seeing that in some places today. And people can't buy food if they don't have the mark of the beast on that point. So you got two things going on here. One is, if you don't worship this beast in the temple, this statue, you're going to get killed. And number two is, if you don't have this mark of the beast on your forehead or your arm, then you can't buy or sell anything. So you can't conduct business, you can't go into a business, you can't buy anything, you can't buy food. So most people at that point are going to say, okay, I'll take the mark of the beast, right? What's the big deal? The problem with that is the mark of the beast, once you take it, is fatal. At that point, fatal eternally. It's eternally fatal. Once you take the mark of the beast, you have chosen him forever over God. And that's why Satan is trying to force people to do this with all this stuff that he's doing at the midpoint of the tribulation here. So that's kind of the point that we're at. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, there are three groups of people that are not going to do this. Actually, four groups that are not going to do this. One of them is the 144,000. We're going to talk about those today. Remember, these are 144,000 Jews that came up back in chapter 7 of Revelation. And their job right after the rapture, right at this point here, right after the rapture, during this first half of the tribulation, their job was to go out into the world and convert people for Christ. So these were 144,000 Jews who all of a sudden just became supernaturally converted for Christ. They were existing Jews that became converted for Christ. And they went out and did great missionary work and converted hundreds of millions of people in the world during this first 3.5 year period. Maybe billions. We don't know the exact number. That's not given to us here in the Bible. But huge numbers of people were converted. And they've now completed their job, and we're going to talk about that today, how they've completed their job. But once they complete their job, understand that there are three remaining groups left that are still on earth at the end of the tribulation, at the end of the midpoint of the tribulation. First of all, you have the believing Jews. And believing Jews are people who are Jews by birth, but who chose to accept Christ. We found out a few chapters ago that God will supernaturally protect them. God will send them off into the desert, and we don't know exactly where that is. It might be a place called Petra, which is actually in Jordan today. But it might be, it might not be. We're not sure, but that's probably where it is. And the second group of people that will not accept the mark of the beast, we learned a number of chapters ago, and actually back in chapter 12, are covenantal Jews, Jews who are so deeply into their faith as Jews that they will remain with the old covenant. They will remain. These are Orthodox Jews and observant Jews. And these are people who are not willing to accept Christ, but they are willing to continue to live their life trying to live up to the 631 commands that God gave them back in the early books of the Bible. And the third group, but they are not supernaturally protected. However, they might have a way to get to eternal life. We'll talk about that. The third group are believing Gentiles. These are people who are not Jews, but who have accepted Christ and haven't been martyred yet, haven't been killed yet. So these are the three groups of people that will not accept the mark of the beast and that will not worship the beast. The other people left on earth at this point, at the midpoint, are people who have accepted the mark of the beast. And there might still be a small number of undecideds left. It's going to be hard to still be undecided at this point when you can't buy anything and when people are looking to lop your head off if you don't go worship the statue. So there's not going to be a lot of undecideds left, but there will be some, and we'll talk about that and what God's going to do for them in the second half of the tribulation as we get into it. But let's look now at the 144,000. Okay, so chapter 14 opens with the story of the 144,000 now standing with Jesus on Mount Zion. Now, Mount Zion is actually inside the city limits of Jerusalem. It is one of the three mountains in Jerusalem. It's really a hill, but it's called a mountain. There's the Temple Mount, which is Mount Moriah. There's Mount Zion, and there's the Mount of Olives. Those are the three mountains that are inside the city limits of Jerusalem. And the Temple Mount is where the temple stood, and that's where Jesus was crucified, on Temple Mount. Mount Zion is the political capital of Israel. That's where David built his palace, was on Mount Zion. And today, interestingly enough, the Israeli parliament meets on Mount Zion. So today it's the political capital as well of Israel. And then the third one, the Mount of Olives, is across from the temple. It's just to the east of the temple. And that's where Jesus ascended into heaven and where Jesus will come back someday. He will come back and land on that. That's a future chapter we'll talk about. So it's saying here that Jesus is standing with these 144,000 Jews on Mount Zion. Well, first of all, many of them have been martyred already. We knew that from what we had learned previously. So how could all 144,000 be standing with him? Many of them are dead. So that's the first problem with this. The second problem is that last time we actually saw Jesus himself in the book of Revelation was way back in chapter 8. And at that point, he was in heaven in the throne room of God. And we know he doesn't come back to earth for the second coming here until chapter 19. And we're only in chapter 14. So how does Jesus get to earth to meet with them on Mount Zion? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, we think he's in heaven right now. So let's keep going through the story a little bit more. The 144,000, first of all, are Jewish men. Sorry, ladies, but these are men. They're standing next to Jesus. They're marked by God, the text tells us. We know that they have brought an uncountable multitude of people to Christ over the last 3.5 years, during this first half of the tribulation. Huge number of people have been brought in by these people going out, these 144,000, going out around the world and preaching and teaching. So it seems that this can't be the Mount Zion that's in Jerusalem, because it doesn't work. Jesus is in heaven. Most of these people are already dead because they've been persecuted and martyred during the first half of the tribulation. So for them to all be standing with Jesus together, it doesn't seem like it's the Mount Zion that we think of when we think of Jerusalem. So let's keep looking a little further through the text. What we hear next is as John hears a sound from heaven. And it's not really a sound, it's not really just a sound, it's a loud, thundering sound. When we think of thunder, we think of the voice of God or something, right? It's a loud, thundering sound. It says in the text that it's a sound of many waters and a sound of loud thunder. It also says it's a voice like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. So this is some sound that we can't even begin to relate to that John is hearing. Well, it doesn't sound like a sound you would hear on earth either. It's possible that this might be in heaven. It's not absolutely clear, but this might be the voice of God, possibly. It's not clear from the text that it is, but it might be. But here's the giveaway. It says that they, the 144,000, were singing a song in front of the throne of God and before the four living creatures. And then it goes on to say that only the 144,000 could learn the song. So who else could be singing it other than the 144,000? So it means they have to be in heaven, right? It means this Mount Zion has to be in heaven, not the Mount Zion we think of in Jerusalem. It goes on to say that they've been purchased from the earth. Purchased from the earth is a term we see in a lot of places in the Bible. It means that they've been purchased from their sins by the death of Christ on the cross. So they've been, Christ, by dying for them on the cross, has purchased them from their sins. So that's what it means. It doesn't mean these people are perfect. It means that they are not sinners. They are converted to Christ. So why does John say they're on Mount Zion? The answer might be that in the New Testament, we see Mount Zion frequently used for a place in heaven. The first example I'll give you is from Hebrews 12:22. Let me read you Hebrews 12:22. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem. And to myriads of angels. So apparently there's also a place in heaven that's called Mount Zion. We didn't know that until the New Testament. There's no place in the Old Testament that it talks about this. But in the New Testament, we now know that there is a place in heaven that's called Mount Zion also. So Jesus is standing here with these 144,000 Jews on Mount Zion. That Mount Zion must be in heaven. It's the only way this thing makes any sense. Then now everything works. This whole thing all works together. It hangs together. So Jesus is in heaven with 144,000. By the way, that's an exact number, the way it's set up in Greek. It's an exact number. So that means every single one of them are there. There's the next question. How did they all get there? Let me go back one, before I go to that question actually, let me go to one more place where Paul tells us also about Mount Zion. He tells us in Romans 11:26 that Jesus, when he returns, will come from the heavenly Mount Zion down to earth. So let's read Romans 11:26. This is Paul now. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. The deliverer, that would be Jesus, will come from Zion, that would be in heaven. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. Jacob is Israel, so he will remove sin from Israel. When he comes down for the second coming, sin will be gone from Israel and from the world. So we know now that the 144,000 that are being talked about here are actually in heaven. They're not on earth in Mount Zion in Jerusalem. They're in heaven. And we know that for a lot of reasons we just went through, but one of them is that Jesus isn't on earth yet. He won't return back to the earth until chapter 19, which is still a number of weeks in the future. So now let's look at the additional information that we've been given about the 144,000 Jews. First of all, it says that these Jews have not been defiled by women, and it goes on to say that they are chaste and that they are virgins. So we can assume from that, and obviously they are men, we can assume that these are probably fairly young men who have not gotten married yet. So these 144,000 Jews that God supernaturally converts were probably fairly young Jews. We don't know what age or whatever, but they were probably fairly young. We know that they were chaste, and that as a result of this, they had no family commitments. Their commitment was to preach the gospel of Christ in the world. And that's what they did during the first half of the tribulation, was to preach the gospel of Christ in the world. That was their only mission, and they were absolutely convicted of doing that. As I said, the way it's used in Greek, the 144,000 is an exact number. So at this point, we know that they've all left the earth because they're all standing with Jesus. It's an exact number of 144,000 are standing with Jesus in heaven. So they've all left the earth. So they are the first group since the rapture where the entire group has left the earth and gotten to heaven. So at this point, at the midpoint of the tribulation, every single one of the 144,000 are now gone. They're all gone from the earth. They're all in heaven. It says they were purchased. We saw in a few chapters ago in Revelation 5, verse 9, we saw the phrase, and they sang a new song saying, worthy are you to take the book and to break the seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So Jesus, when he was slain on the cross, purchased everyone in the world. So that's where purchased comes from. These people were purchased, which means they accepted Christ. They were converted for Christ. Now, it goes on to talk a little bit more about these folks. It says they were the first fruits for God. Now, first fruits is another term we see a whole lot in the Bible. And first fruits means that when you're harvesting something, the thing you pick first is the best, right? You always pick the best fruits first, because if it rains tonight, you might not be able to pick it tomorrow. Or if it's windy tonight, it might get blown away or whatever. So you try to pick the best fruits first. So they are the first fruits. Obviously not the church. The church was gone at the rapture, but they are the first fruits to be totally in heaven of any group in the Bible that was here during the period of the tribulation. They are the first one to totally make it to heaven. all 144,000 have now made it to heaven. Every single one of them has made it to heaven, is what the first fruits is telling us. So what's going on? Yeah.
You're missing the next page.
I'm missing another page?
Yes.
Seriously?
Give me that page and put it on the back. No, it's on the back, the first page where you're talking about. They've got the first page.
I'm missing the page that starts off with face death. Does everybody have a fourth page that starts off with face to death? No?
That's all right. That's right.
Yeah, teaching on the other side of this page. Let me give you a different copy of it. This is going to be the page right there. Okay, we haven't gotten to it yet, so you haven't missed anything. I'll try to talk slow until she gets back. So we're talking about first fruits. And we saw all the way back in Leviticus chapter 23 that the first fruits are the first fruits of the harvest. That means that you are bringing in the best of your harvest first. You bring it, and that's the very first thing you bring in. So God has harvested these people up to heaven very early on in the process. They are the first ones, and at the end of the midpoint, they are now fully gone from the earth, and they're fully in heaven, is what we're saying here. So at this point, we have to conclude that all 144,000 are gone from the earth. That's the only way that any of this makes sense. Is they're all gone from the earth, they're all in heaven. So the question is, who's down here on earth converting people anymore, right? Remember, God has given us, up until, during the church age, we were all here, right? Our job was to convert people for Christ during the church age. But at the rapture, we're all gone. So at the rapture, God comes up with two other solutions. He comes up with the 144,000 who are going to go convert the world, and they're going to convert the world during the first half. And then he also comes up with the two witnesses in Jerusalem who are going to preach, and their preaching will be heard by everybody on earth. So he's got two ways of getting the message out during the first half of the tribulation. But at the midpoint, the two witnesses are killed, right, by the beast, and then they get taken up to heaven. They get resurrected and taken up to heaven. And the 144,000 have now all been martyred. They've been martyred during this period, and by this point, they're all totally martyred. So who's left on earth to preach to the people during the second half? And we're going to find the answer to that next week. That's next week. God's going to send a whole different group. There's going to be angels that are going to come next week. But I don't want to take next week's class from us. So we're now at the point where the last of the people on earth who are out there converting people for Christ are gone at the midpoint. And that's another key thing that defines the midpoint. There's nobody else left on earth that's out there trying to convert people for God. Okay. So getting back to these three groups here. Remember, we saw back in Revelation 7, verses 2 through 3, that these three groups are still on earth during this tribulation period. But none of them are, but this group is in Petra. They're not out doing anything. They're just protecting themselves, being protected by God. There are still some covenantal Jews out there who might be out there working with people. But the Jewish religion typically is not an outgoing, I don't know if outgoing is the right word, it's typically not an evangelistic religion where they're out trying to convert people around the world. So chances are there's not a lot of evangelism going on here. There are some believing Gentiles left in the world who have refused the mark and haven't been murdered yet. There'll be some of those floating around, but there's not a whole lot of people left on earth at this point who are still going to be out there doing anything for Christ. Now, earlier, back in Revelation 6:6, we were told that the judgments from God at that time wouldn't harm Israel. So during the first half of the tribulation, there were two kinds of judgments going on. The judgments going on were coming either from the Antichrist starting wars or from God hurling judgments at the earth. But the judgments hurled at the earth during this period did not affect the Jews. That will change during the second half During the second half, most of the judgments are going to be coming, first of all, from the Antichrist. He is now really Satan. It's coming from the beast. So it's now really Satan. And Satan is going to be deliberately going after these three groups, right? He's going to try to kill off all of these three groups. And yeah, so the judgments will be coming at those people during the second half. And we were told back last week in Revelation 12:11 that believers would be ready to give up their lives during the tribulation period and would give testimony to God even when they face death. And this is now at the point where we're at on page, just beginning of page 4. So believers, in order to be a believer at this time, you have to realize that you will almost certainly be martyred. Very, 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 very few believers will survive until the end point of the tribulation, the second coming. Most of the few that are left in these groups, I mean, this group will totally survive, the ones that are in Petra, but most of the two groups that are in here will not survive the second half of the tribulation. So they realize that they face death if they have a testimony for Christ. But they also realize at this point that they have a choice. They can either face death now or face eternal death if they take, in 3.5 years, if they take the mark of the beast. So most of them are going to stay with it and go to their deaths during that period. It's going to be a very difficult time in the second half. So with all the evangelists now gone, how do the remaining people on earth get saved? The people who are still undecided, and there aren't that many of them, but how did they get undecided? Or how do they get saved? You know, the last human evangelists are gone. They're off the earth. And all the people whom God chose to evangelize the earth, the 144,000 and the 2 witnesses, they're gone. So, you know, who's going to do this job? And the answer is, we're going to see next week that God is going to send 3 angels to the earth. And that's going to be later on in chapter 14. And those 3 angels are going to preach the gospel. And they will truly preach it to every person on earth. And that will be during the second half of the tribulation. So God is going to take people out of the equation for the second half. And the gospel preaching will be done by angels. Yeah.
Now, when you say they're going to preach to everyone on earth, does this mean that everyone on earth will hear them at the same time? Or are they going to be moving around? What's your thoughts?
I'd like to handle that one next week when we actually get to it. But my instinct is that this is going to be kind of like on the first Pentecost, where everybody hears this in their own language at the same time, is kind of my instinct. I mean, you know, are the angels going to speak Hebrew? Are they going to speak Greek? Are they going to speak English? Are they going to speak Russian? Are they going to speak Chinese? I think the answer is whatever you want to hear, that's what you're going to hear. That's what I think is going to happen. And, you know, they're going to be flying around in the air. We'll go through this whole story next week about the 3 angels. But they're going to be flying around in the air. And does that mean they're going to just fly to different parts of the earth and preach in Australia today and then, you know, New Zealand tomorrow and South America the day after that? I don't think so. I kind of think everybody's going to hear them and see them at the same time. Kind of like the preaching of Pentecost Sunday is kind of what I think.
Is there something somewhere between chapter 7 and chapter 14 where you're at today that talks about the 144,000 being martyred? I mean,
Yeah, I think so. Let me take a look. Let me take a look back at chapter 7.
the reason I asked that, I've been listening to Dave Jeremiah's series on this particular subject here recently, and I guess I thought that 144,000 were protected.
They are protected. Well, they are protected in the sense that they will not fall to Satan during that period. They are protected from that. But let me see if I can find it here.
That's all right. You don't need time now, but I just curious. Now, I knew that the 2 witnesses were protected.
Yeah. Well, it says that they're in heaven at this point, at the midpoint.
Yeah, that part I understand.
So the question is, how'd they get there?
Yeah.
There's no indication whatsoever that they were raptured. That is not in anywhere in the Bible. So they didn't just not die and go to heaven. The question is, how did they get there? And there are places where it talks about the martyrdom of people that is going on. And that's back in chapter 6. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. So these are people who were with Christ. Not the church now. The church is gone. These are people who are with Christ during this period. This chapter 6 is happening during the first half of the tribulation. And then they cry out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, until you avenge?" They want their blood avenged. And Christ gives them they each get a white robe, which is a symbol of being redeemed. So yeah, in chapter 6, we know that people who are for Christ in the first half are going to be martyred. So I think chapter 6 is where I would go. Chapter 6, and that is verse 9.
Which could have preceded the choosing of the 144,000 in chapter 7.
The thing about the first half of the tribulation is there are a bunch of stories, and they all happen during the first half of the tribulation. Yes, it could have preceded it, but it's pretty clear that the 144,000. Let me look at that for a minute again. Yes, it could have preceded the choosing of the 144,000, because it says, "After this I saw the angel," and then he talks about the 144,000. So yes, it's clear that people who accept Christ during the first half are going to be martyred, a lot of them. But it's not yet clear that the 144,000 are among them. But we know later on that they're going to end up in heaven at the midpoint, and there's no indication whatsoever that they were raptured to get there. So the presumption is that they were martyred to get there. Okay. Good question. Thank you. Other? Okay. So the 144,000 have completed their mission. They were chosen to evangelize the world. The time for sharing their faith and persuading people by other people is now over. And the number of undecideds in the world is dropping, and it's heading towards 0. And the Lord, as I said, is going to offer one final opportunity to the undecideds to believe. And he's going to send 3 angels to the earth to preach the gospel to all nations, and to all tongues and all people. So there you go. All tongues would seem to imply that this angel is going to be able to talk to anybody, regardless of what they hear. They're going to fly through the air over the entire earth. They'll be heard by all people everywhere. Jesus says in Matthew 24:14, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So Jesus is talking in 24:14 about this situation where the 3 angels are going to preach the gospel around the world just before the end, just during that last half of the tribulation period. So all the remaining undecideds on earth are going to get one last chance, and that's right at the beginning of the second half of the tribulation. They'll get one last chance to listen to these angels and make the decision for Christ. So for 2,000 years, God used us to give people opportunities to accept Him around the world. And then during the first half, He gave them a second chance. He gave them the 144,000 Jews, and He even gave them a third chance, and that was the 2 witnesses. And now we're going to see next week He will give them, as we enter the second half, He will give them one last chance, and that is the 3 angels that are going to fly over it. So it's kind of a decision point. We're at the point where people have to make a decision, and there's no way to put this off any longer. If you try not to make a decision, you're going to get your head cut off by a beast, and you're not going to be able to buy anything. We don't know yet about the head cut off. That actually comes in a subsequent chapter, so we haven't learned that yet. The way people are being martyred by the beast is with the head cut off, as we'll find out later. So that brings us to the end of today's class. Anybody have any other questions we haven't talked about? Well, thank you again, everyone. Thank you, folks at home, for joining us. Next week, join us, and we'll get into the beginning of the second half of the tribulation.
Thank you.
It's still on, Deb.